Heel raises are really one of the most quintessential exercises for the foot and ankle. From a tissue healing and rehabilitation perspective, it's a critical exercise for conditions like Achilles or tibialis posterior or even peroneal tendinopathy, as well as with common foot conditions like plantar fasciitis. And really with any mechanical foot or ankle problem, or really any lower extremity problem for that matter, it's a key exercise because it facilitates and maintains general health and function of the foot and ankle. Because essentially what a heel raise represents and what it trains is the push-off phase of walking or running gait. But with these exercises, there's a few important things we need to keep in mind. First, whether our focus is on building strength or endurance, or if our goal is to rehabilitate an injured Achilles tendon or plantar fascia, the primary objective is to create progressive force and progressive loading through the injured tissue itself or through the muscles of the foot and ankle. Now, this concept of progressive loading is really important here. So we need to get the dose and the effort right for each patient or each client. Now, if the exercises are too easy, it's not going to provide the desired adaptation stimulus, but if it's too hard, it's going to affect the quality of the exercise and may even flare up the condition. This is why when it comes to strength exercises or loading exercises, I like to think of them and organize them in progressive exercise tracks. These tracks are essentially a group of the same or similar movements arranged in order of increasing difficulty or increased load demands. Now, this really allows us to find the right effort level for each patient, and it helps us to know where to start, but also where we're going with each patient and each client. Essentially, as one exercise becomes too easy, we can easily progress the patient or client to the next exercise in the progression. Also, as these progressions are just slight variations on an existing theme, the patient doesn't have to learn a completely new movement. And finally, as each progression represents just a small increase in loading and physical demands, it really minimizes the chances of flaring up an existing injury or an existing condition. So with that said, let's move on to the exercises themselves. The 4 progressions we're going to cover are going to be the basic bilateral heel raise, the heel raise with isometric shift, the eccentric heel raise, and finally the single leg heel raise. And just as one last reminder, remember if you are a My Rehab Connection subscriber and you use our exercise prescription software, you can find this progression in our exercise library. You can either search for each exercise by name in the library itself, or you can find it in the exercise group section under the title Foot Ankle Strength Progression, Heel Raise Progression. All right, now let's look at each exercise. All right, let's start by looking at our first progression, which is going to be our basic bilateral heel raise. Now, let's talk about this in a little bit more detail because we're going to get the form right in terms of what the feet need to do and what position we're going to need to be in. And these themes are going to continue through the rest of the exercise. So first off, you can modify some of the basic positions here, whether you want to have them do it off a step or just off the floor. What my preferred way to do this is going to be leaning against the wall for support, but I'm going to have the patient lean forward and even bend the knees a little bit. This way, when they're going down into that bottom position of the heel raise, we're going to create some of that ankle dorsiflexion to get a little bit more length through the Achilles and through the tissue into the feet. But in this way, we keep the toes and the forefoot nice and flat. So it becomes a little bit of a more natural progression and natural position. And again, we can use the wall for support, which is especially important when we get into some of the later exercises, which are going to be more single leg support. For the most part with this group of exercises, I care a little bit less about balance and that sort of thing. Really what I'm trying to do is create stress and load through the tissue. So if we take the balance component out, we're going to be able to focus more on that tissue stress and tissue loading component. I would also typically like this to be in bare feet whenever possible. Again, this gets a little bit more movement through the foot, and especially through the forefoot and through those metatarsal joints. But again, if we need to modify this to put a shoe on, if there's a little bit of some symptom into the forefoot, that's certainly acceptable, especially into the early ranges, or excuse me, early phases of the exercises. Lastly, when we are going up on the feet, I like to keep the weight over the big toe and over that first metatarsal joint. That doesn't mean we want the feet to cave in, but I do want to avoid as best as possible kind of this outer motion of the foot, which is very common in a lot of people. This outer rotation where the weight goes more towards the fifth toe and the fifth metatarsal, this is more of this low gear push off, which is going to load more the lateral part of the foot, which especially with things like plantar fasciitis and foot issues, this is going to be not as effective to get that stress and load through the medial part of the foot and the plantar fascia. And essentially when we're toeing off with running and walking gait, we want that weight to go through that first metatarsal. So it's just good practice to develop some of these key movements right from the beginning. Okay, so with that said, let's talk about how to apply these principles and how to do our first basic progression. So first off, what we're going to do here, like I said, we're leaning into the wall. I want to create some dorsiflexion and some elongation through the Achilles. I can even bend my feet a little bit just to the point where those heels start to lift off the ground. From here, I'm going to slowly raise up, and I want to make sure I am getting the patient or the client to raise up as high as they can. I want them fighting for every last little degree of motion. I want to create that good extension through the metatarsal joints, especially that first metatarsal joint. I'm going to hold this position or have them hold it just a second or two. I just want a distinct pause and stop at the bottom. And then I'm going to go slow. And this key is slow. I want slow eccentric motion all the way down. As long as it's tolerated for the patient, I want that heel going down towards the floor, but I don't want it to be hitting the floor. I want them to be creating that stretch and elongation through the back of the calf in this position. Hold the bottom position 1 to 2 seconds, and then nice and slow, way back up to the top. Remember, we want to fight for every last inch of motion that we can. Hold for a second, slowly back down. Okay, for our next progression is going to be our bilateral heel raise, but at the top of the motion, we're going to add a single leg isometric shift. So again, we're going to use the same starting position where we're leaning into a wall. Knees are forward a little bit if we need to, just to create a little bit of that elongation through the back of the calf so we get those heels just ever so slightly off the ground. From this position, we're going to raise up nice and high, just like we did in our previous progression. We're going to get right up over those toes. I want that stress and bend going right through that first metatarsal joint. Now, at the top of this motion, I am going to lift and slowly shift my weight onto one side. I'm going to hold this position just for a couple of seconds. I'm then going to put my raised foot back on the floor. Weight is going to be evenly distributed between right and left sides. And then I'm going to let this go slowly back down to the starting position. So I'm going to go slowly up on 2, shift over, slowly accept the weight onto the affected leg. Hold for just 1 to 2 seconds. Foot goes back down, slowly back this way. Now, a couple of really key points to point out here is what we're looking for is the ability to accept full weight. When I go up, this is an isometric position. As I shift over, I don't want that foot to be dropping. I want to make sure there's enough strength to accept the weight. And of course, we want it to be tolerated. The other thing to keep in mind here is sometimes this can be a big step for patients. Almost like the 2-leg heel raise or the bilateral heel raise is a little bit too easy, but this one becomes a little bit too challenging. When this is the case, we can do a partial shift. So what I mean by that is if we had our equal weight on both sides and we shifted all of our weight to one side, we're obviously going from a 50-50 to a 100%, 0% weight distribution. But if we were to do that very slowly, I'm at the top and I shift my weight over a little bit, we can kind of do a partial shift. So we have more weight onto one side, but we still have a little bit of support on our non-affected leg. This can also be a nice way to start to introduce some of this progression, but not an all or none sort of way to do it. So this can help ease into that weight acceptance, and it also becomes a marker that you can track with patients. In this case, our little mini goal on the way to our big goals is being able to accept the full weight onto that single leg. Okay, so our third progression is going to be our eccentric heel raise. Again, very similar starting position, leaning against the wall, get the knees forward just slightly to create that stretch and elongation through the back of the calf. Heels are slightly off the ground. Again, I'm going to go slowly up. Again, just like we saw with our first three progressions, or excuse me, our first two progressions, we're lifting nice and high. Every last little degree of motion possible. Weight is distributed, pushing through the first toe. Now from this position, again, I'm going to shift over. Again, I'm going to take a second to fully accept the weight. But now, instead of putting the other foot back down, I'm going to very slowly drop that heel down towards the floor. As long as it's tolerated, I'm going to try to drop down, create that stretch through the back of the calf. Don't let the heel quite fully rest on the floor. From the bottom position, I'm then putting my other foot back on, and 50-50 weight distribution. I'm going back up. Again, full range, weight right over the big toe. Slowly shifting over to accept the weight, slowly dropping down. Remember, the key with this is really slow. It's actually much more effective and much more challenging to make sure we're very slow on the descent. We don't want an uncontrolled drop. We want to make sure we're creating effort and that eccentric control of that heel dropping down towards the floor. Okay, so our final progression here is going to be our basic single leg heel raise. Now, just as a side note, as I kind of mentioned in the introduction, these heel raises are really one of those quintessential exercises. And this is one of the points with foot and ankle patients, and really with most lower extremity patients. This single leg heel raise is really what I'm trying to get every patient to do. Now, that might not be possible in every patient, but at least it's my goal to be able to get each patient to this stage. And once they're at this stage, this can also become a nice little maintenance exercise to maintain function of the ankle and the foot in the big picture. So again, what we're going to do here, same initial starting position. I'm leaning against the wall, knees slightly forward. I want those heels raised up. But now here, instead of lifting up on two legs, I'm going to shift over on a single leg. And now from this position, I'm going nice and slow up. The key is I want to try to get that good full range of motion again, right to the top. Again, weight stays centered over the forefoot, over that first metatarsal joint. I'm only going to hold for just a pause, 1 to 2 seconds, and then I'm nice and slow back down to the floor. Again, as long as it's tolerated, I want to create that little stretch through the back of the calf and through the Achilles. Slowly up again, nice and high. Fight for every last little degree of motion. Distinct, short, but distinct stop at the top. Slowly back down. All the way up. Hold for just a moment. Slowly back down. Slow and controlled on the descent. Slow and controlled with that eccentric phase of the exercise. So now that we've reviewed the exercises themselves, let's take a moment and talk about programming and progression criteria. First, as we're trying to develop strength and or improve connective tissue quality and capacity, we need to make sure we are creating a sufficient exercise challenge. So here we are going to typically prescribe 3 to 5 sets per session. But instead of prescribing a specific number of repetitions, I will have patients perform exercises to fatigue. So in other words, I tell patients to perform as many repetitions as they can, but not to go past the point where their form starts to break down or they feel they are no longer in control of the movement. And I'm certainly telling them not to go past the point where the exercises become painful. I also want my patient to keep track of their numbers because that is largely how I'm going to determine when they need to progress to the next exercise, or in some cases where we may need to regress the exercise. What I'm typically looking for here is I want each patient to be able to work within sets of 8 to 15 repetitions. If the exercise flares up the condition or they can't perform at least 8 repetitions, I'm likely going to regress the exercise. Likewise, when they can easily perform 12 to 15 repetitions, I'm going to progress them on to the next exercise in line. Now, in terms of frequency, remember we also need to build in adequate recovery. So we need a minimum of 1 day between exercise sessions, which means I'm going to have them perform these exercises 2 to 3 times a week. Now, I should also point out here that even though it's beyond the scope of this particular video, these exercises are not likely going to be the only ones they're performing. So within this strength section, they will be performing the heel raise progression, but this also may be part of a general foot or ankle or even a general lower extremity strengthening routine or circuit. Lastly, let's talk about planning and programming for a week. While these strength exercises are important, these patients will likely also be performing mobility and control exercises, which are typically done on a daily basis. So just as an example here, if we were, say, using this heel raise progression for a foot and ankle patient, I would also be having these patients performing our basic or advanced foot ankle mobility movement sequence, and we're typically going to do this once a day or maybe even twice a day. Then 2 to 3 days a week, I'm also going to plug in these strength endurance exercises into their rehab or conditioning program.